classic consoles, or mini consoles, as it's sometimes known. These miniaturized versions' main purpose are for casual fans looking for a simple way to play old games cheaper and easier. Now, for some of you looking at this timeline, you may say that there are a few consoles missing perhaps. I started the timeline at the NES in 2016 when it originally released, and added each future release mini console that best represented the console it was trying to emulate, with a few exceptions of course, which we'll get to later. Starting out, we have the NES Classic. Like I said, this released in 2016 and was available through 2017. It was hard to get, and I personally did not find one. This is the beginning of the mini console craze as we know it. Due to popular demand, it was relaunched in 2018 and was available until the end of that year. The next year, Nintendo was back at it with the Super Nintendo Classic Edition. This only included 21 games, but these are ultimate classics. And to this day, I still consider the Super Nintendo Classic the best value for a mini console. The 21 games included Castlevania 4, Contra 3, Super Mario World, Super Metroid, A Link to the Past, Earthbound, and Star Fox 2. Games that will cost you well over the MSRP of the Super Nintendo Classic Edition. The next year is when things really started to heat up. The C64 Mini came over from Europe in October and included 64 games. Now that same month, the GEO Mini launched in North America as well. Now this is where we get to some of those exceptions. I've never purchased the GEO Mini, and I never planned to. When it launched, it was $100 and included 40 games. The overall quality of it was quite poor, from the emulation to the controllers. Right now, it's sitting around the $50 to $60 mark on Amazon. If it gets down to $30 to $40, I might get one. Emphasis on might. As it is now, I have no interest in it. SNK made way too many models, and it lacks an overall visual appeal as well as just emulation. If they made it look like an actual Neo Geo home console, I probably would have picked it up day one. But instead, trying to go for a small arcade cabinet seems cool, but that's all it is. It just seems cool. It looks kind of nice on the shelf. But the purpose of these mini consoles is to be a cheap alternative for original hardware. This is something that definitely could have been a $60 mini console. Instead, choosing to add a controller and a screen on board drove the price way up. This isn't even mentioning the low quality controllers they included. Moving on, we have the PlayStation Classic. This released the same year in December. When this was first announced, I was really excited. Now, the overall quality of the actual console is excellent. The controllers are also excellent. Now, of course, they are not dual analog sticks, but I can get past that. 20 games, let's see what they have. At the beginning, they announced Final Fantasy VII as well as Metal Gear Solid. That looks good. But then the rest of the lineup kind of drug it down. Games like Grand Theft Auto and Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six doesn't make any sense to me. Now, I've heard it before. People will ask, why is Resident Evil 2, Crash Bandicoot, Spyro not on there? At the time, I knew those games weren't going to come to the system because Spyro and Crash had remakes come out very recently. The Resident Evil 2 remake was coming as well. And of course, we would soon see why Medieval and Resident Evil 3 wouldn't come to the console as well. Even with all this, I still think people would have been fine buying the PlayStation Classic to get the original version and still buying the remakes. And there's still no excuse for not having Silent Hill or a Mega Man game of any kind. Overall, the PlayStation Classic was a disappointment, but it's the best and only one we got. I didn't even mention the PAL versions they included with this console. But let's keep going. The next year, the Sega Genesis Mini released. This was originally announced back in 2018 and was supposed to launch that holiday. After a large fan backlash, Sega went back to the drawing board and dropped AtGames. At this point, AtGames had already released 2 Genesis Flashbacks, both of which of low quality. In March of 2019, Sega re-announced the Sega Genesis Mini. Over the next few months, they showed off more and more games. The list grew to 42 total games, and we found out M2 was behind the emulation. We knew all was well. In September of 2019, the console released, and aesthetically, it is by far the most accurate mini console released so far. The games included are emulated to near perfection. With 2 controllers included, the only downside was the fact that they didn't include 6-button controllers. These, however, could be bought separately, and it never really bothered me, but it did irritate some people. Overall, Sega gave us a mini console to really rival Nintendo's offerings. Heading into the next month, AtGames released another 2600 Flashback. I would have preferred they just put Atari Flashback Mini or Atari 2600 Mini, but they chose not to do that. The name, of course, doesn't really matter. The point is, this console looks amazing. Like I said in the beginning, I chose only to include the consoles that best represent the consoles they're trying to emulate. This is why I didn't include any previous flashbacks, including Genesis flashbacks and all other Atari flashbacks. This one, however, has to be included. AtGames went back to the drawing board and got everything right. After seeing the mini console craze, AtGames got it right with legitimate switches and a console design that looks just like the 2600. Putting the controller ports on the back is just weird enough to feel authentic. All I have to say is keep it up, AtGames. I'd like to see what you guys do next, now that you know what you're doing. As for the other flashback consoles from AtGames, in the future I might make a timeline looking at those more in depth. Let me know if that's something that might interest you down in the comments. Now at E3 in 2019, Konami announced that they were going to be doing their own mini console for the TurboGrafx 16. And in May of this year, it did release. Now this is another $100 mini console, and mini may be a little exaggerated. Now I haven't picked one of these up, definitely probably waiting until Christmas, hopefully a price drop. Overall, the only complaints for this one is its larger size and the amount of Japanese games it has. I don't really understand that second complaint too much though. The TurboGrafx 16 did really poor over here. Most of its great games are Japanese only. The fact that Konami decided to include them at all is amazing, in my opinion. Of course I get it, people wanted them to be translated, and I can agree for games like Snatcher. Of course you have to admit, this is a quality product. And that brings us to today. Sega recently announced the GameGear Micro coming this October, so far only announced in Japan. Now I've already talked about how I'm pretty disappointed how they're going about it. I'll put a card for that up top. I still want to believe they're going to surprise us, say it has a mini HDMI port or something, so that way we can at least play it and see it at the same time. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem likely. Well, this is every mini console that's released so far. I hope you guys learned something, and thank you so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day.